I'm Megan Ossie. I'm excited that you guys are all here. This session is designed to engage pharmacy students, technicians, and pharmacists in the critical topic about compounding standards and the role of the pharmacist in that. So we're excited to welcome today's presenters, Michelle Farrell and Holly Sheldon. Michelle is the lead luminary of CPESN Wisconsin and a past PSW president, and owner of Boscobel Pharmacy and Center Pharmacy in Wisconsin's Driftless region. A 2000 graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Pharmacy, she is certified in pharmacogenomics, immunizations, diabetes self-management education, and compounding, providing comprehensive patient-centered services to a rural community. Is there anything you don't do? No. Exactly. True. And then joining Michelle is Holly Sheldon. Holly developed a passion for quality improvement and patient safety during pharmacy school, which led her to complete a PGY1 and PGY2 medication use safety and policy residency at Froedtert Hospital. Holly is the pharmacy compliance coordinator at Children's, so I have the pleasure of working with her. And with a background in medication use safety and policy, her focus on regulatory compliance and opioid stewardship. And she works to emphasize streamlined workflows, technology, and teamwork to improve patient safety. You can find their full bios in the conference app. So please join me in welcoming Holly and Michelle. You guys. So much. That's okay.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that introduction. Michelle and I are very excited to be here to talk to everyone today about USP 795 updates, which are mixing it up in the community and hospital settings with new non-sterile compounding standards. We have no financial relationships to disclose for this presentation, and we also did not use any artificial intelligence in creation of this presentation. After completion of this program, pharmacists and pharmacy technician learners will be able to identify new requirements in the October 2024 update of USP 795, describe challenges, strategies, and tips for both hospital pharmacies and community pharmacies in implementing these new standards. First, before we talk about the changes to USP 795, it's very important to understand what USP 795 is and where it applies. USP 795 is a set of standards for non-compounded, non-sterile preparations, also referred to as CNSPs, for human and animal use. So veterinary pharmacies are also on the hook for these standards. The goal of USP 795 is to compound the safest CNSPs possible for our patients by reducing the risk of excessive microbial contamination, ensuring the correct ingredients are used for CNSPs, that the resultant CNSP is within 10% of its intended strength, to prevent physical and chemical incompatibilities and contaminants, and lastly, ensure appropriate quality ingredients are used for CNSPs. It's really important to understand where USP 795 applies and where it doesn't apply. So where it does apply is compounding. And this is when we are mixing drugs and ingredients together to create a what we will ultimately dispense to the patient. And you may be altering the chemical composition of the drug. And this is for solid or liquid oral dosage forms, rectal dosage forms, vaginal dosage forms, topical dosage forms, nasal dosage forms, and otic dosage forms. Repackaging, on the other hand, is outside of the scope of USP 795. And this is when we are not altering the chemical composition of the drug that we are dispensing. So this could be unit dose packaging of non-sterile products, such as bubble packing tablets, splitting tablets, reconstituting according to manufacturer label instructions, or lastly, preparation of a single dose for a single patient to be used within 4 hours, such as opening a capsule or crushing a tablet. USP 795 will be incorporated into Wisconsin FAR 15 actually in 2025, not 2026, so I apologize for that typo. And Michelle's going to talk about that in greater detail later on in the presentation. It is also currently surveyable by the Joint Commission and other accrediting agencies, and it is included in federal law by the US FDA through means of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, Section 503A, which is patient-specific compounding. Now that we know what USP 795 is, let's talk about the requirements. First, you need to have a designated area for non-sterile compounding where no other activities occur at the time of compounding. There must be enough space to arrange all components in an orderly fashion to prevent mix-ups, and the surfaces must be easily cleaned, so no fabric or carpet. This area should include a storage area that is off the floor and temperature monitored, a sink with hot and cold water, and I would highly recommend a hookup to reverse osmosis water, and you'll see later why that can be helpful. And then, of course, an area to perform the compounding itself. USB 795 discusses the use of closed system processing devices to protect employees from airborne particles. And it ranges greatly in simplicity and cost. The most simple is a single use containment bag, which is exactly how it sounds, a bag where you can put tablets in and then use a device to crush them. And the bag is what contains the vapors, or excuse me, the powder airborne particles. A bit more complicated is a containment ventilated enclosure, or CVE. You may also hear this referred to as a powder hood. And this actually uses airflow to move the airborne contaminants away from the compounder. And then the most complicated is a biological safety cabinet, which is externally vented and again uses airflow to direct the particles away from the compounder. USB 795 requires that surfaces are cleaned with a cleaning agent followed by a sanitizing agent, or you can use a combination cleaning and sanitizing agent such as Preempt on this slide. For equipment and utensils, you must first clean them with a cleaning agent such as soap and water, but then you must do a final rinse with purified water. And this is an instance where having a reverse osmosis hookup is very useful. Otherwise, you end up using a lot of sterile water for irrigation just to rinse your utensils. USP 795 has a bit of different requirements for the frequency of cleaning compared to USP 797, which hospital pharmacy folks might be a bit more familiar with. So, work surfaces must be cleaned at the start and end of each shift. Equipment must be cleaned at the start of the shift between different CNSPs. Storage shelves must be cleaned every 3 months. Floors must be cleaned daily. And then walls and ceilings only need to be cleaned if there's known or suspected contamination. The reason that work surfaces have to be cleaned more frequently for non-sterile compounding compared to sterile compounding is because there's so much more particle generation when you are performing non-sterile compounding. The garbing process is relatively simple. So you need to remove all personal outer garments, jewelry, headphones, and earbuds. You can keep your white coat on. You need to wash your hands for 30 seconds with soap and water, and then dry them completely before donning clean, non-sterile gloves. These gloves should either be changed or wiped down in between preparations with different ingredients. And of course, they should be replaced if they are damaged or soiled. USB 795 has a list of required annual staff competencies, and we'll talk about later the challenges of ensuring that all of your staff remain competent in all of these areas that are required. USP 795 also requires the use of master formulation records and compounding records, and it can be a little confusing of what the difference is between these. So, a master formulation record is a recipe for the compounders to follow to make a product, whereas a compounding record is where the compounder records everything that they did to make a specific product. I won't go through all of these requirements, but one of the most important requirements in my opinion, for the master formulation record is having a reference that supports the beyond use date that you assign to your non-sterile products. And for compounding record, basically you have to document every lot, every expiration date, every person who was involved in the compounding and checking of that product. And then you must provide a reference to the MFR that was that was followed to make that CNSP. I mentioned beyond use dates in my master formulation records slide. And this was one of the biggest changes in the new USP 795 updates. So beyond use dates are based on the ability of a CNSP to maintain both chemical and physical stability while not exhibiting excessive microbial growth. And of note, your stability data may dictate a shorter BUD than what is allowed as a maximum BUD per USP 795. USP 795 assumes that CNSPs will be stored in tight, light-resistant containers when they are signing these BUDs, so make sure that is the case for your products if you're using these BUDs. You also need to consider whether a product is aqueous or non-aqueous, and USP 795 has this term that they use called water activity, and if the water activity is greater than or equal to 0.6, then your product is considered aqueous. Within USP 795, there's this giant table of all different products and their water activities, and I would recommend referencing that when you are trying to determine if a product is aqueous or not. And the idea behind this is that the greater water activity there is, the greater ability there is for microbial growth. USP 795 also considers whether a product is preserved or non-preserved. And of note, if at least 50% of the base of a product is preserved, then USP 795 considers the entire product preserved. So for example, if you are crushing tablets and putting them in Aura Plus, since the Aura Plus itself is preserved, then the entire product is considered preserved. And then lastly, USP 795 takes into consideration whether the product is intended for oral or topical use, because there's lower microbial limits for medications that are going to be administered orally. So here is a table of the beyond use states in USP 795. Of note, though, if you have a USP monograph or a stability study that includes antimicrobial effectiveness data, you can extend the beyond use state beyond these maximums in USP 795, but only in those two different instances. Otherwise, for non-preserved aqueous products, the maximum BUD is 14 days, and these products must be stored in the fridge. For preserved aqueous products, these products receive a maximum BUD of 35 days, and they can be stored at room temperature. Oral non-aqueous products receive a maximum BUD of 90 days and can be stored at room temp or in the fridge. And then topical non-aqueous CNSPs receive a maximum BUD of 180 days, again at room temp or in the refrigerator. Another thing to consider is the BUDs of open containers of commercial ingredients. For example, if you open that bottle of Aura Plus, how long can I use it? And interestingly, USP 795 has said that you can use that open container until its manufacturer expiration date. Of course, an exception to this is if the manufacturer states that after opening, you must use the bottle within a certain amount of time, such as for lorazepam oral concentrate. But otherwise, you can continue using it until that date, even for sterile water for irrigation and non-preserved products. I wanted to briefly touch on hazardous drug non-sterile compounding because there is some intersection between USP 800 and USP 795. So USP 800 sets standards to protect employees from hazardous drug exposure, and the Pharmacy Examining Board is also planning to incorporate USP 100 into FAR 15. NIOSH categorizes drugs as Table 1, which are known carcinogens, and Table 2, which is possible carcinogens and/or reproductive toxins. Compounding of Table 1 anti-neoplastic drugs must follow all of the precautions in USP 800. However, compounding of Table 1 non-anti-neoplastics and all of the drugs within Table 2 can be risk assessed to potentially peel back some of the requirements in USP 800. USP 800 has a bunch of information about the PPE and other equipment that must be used for handling hazardous drugs, and I won't go through all of it, but there are some activities that can be determined by your policies SOPs, or excuse me, your facilities SOPs. But it's really important that when you are writing those SOPs to really think about the routes of exposure and making sure that you are adequately protecting your employees. Hazardous drug cleaning is a bit more complicated. For hazardous drug non-sterile compounding, first you must use a deactivating agent, which renders hazardous drugs inert, then a decontamination agent, which removes HG residue, and then lastly, your normal cleaning agent like soap and water. So here's our first learning assessment question. When determining the beyond use state for a CNSP, which of the following should be considered? A, the CNSP's water activity, B, the presence of preservatives, C, topical or oral use, or D, all of the above. And I apologize, I'm not sure how to use the polling activity within the slides. So does anybody want to shout out their answer? Yeah, I'm hearing D, exactly. All of the above. All of those are considered in when determining the beyond use state of a non-sterile product. A second learning assessment question, how often should compounding work surfaces be cleaned? A, once per shift when compounding occurs, or excuse me, A, once per day when compounding occurs, B, once per shift when compounding occurs, C, at the start and end of each shift when compounding occurs, or D, only if known or suspected contamination. Yes, I'm hearing some C's, and that is correct. At the start and end of each shift when compounding occurs, and that increased frequency is because of the increased particle generation that occurs during non-sterile compounding. Next, I'm going to talk about inpatient implementation of some of these standards. This is a picture of the compounding space at Children's Wisconsin. So as you can see, we have plenty of space to arrange all of our different ingredients so that we don't have any mix-ups. We have a sink available. Our powder hood is in that corner. We also have a refrigerator and access to a computer to record all of our activities. For equipment, it's really important to evaluate what you need for your institution's compounding activities. So for the closed system processing devices, you'll want to think about the frequency of powder generating activities. If you are very rarely crushing tablets, perhaps those single-use containment bags make the most sense. But if you're doing this multiple times a day, every day, then you might want to look into a powder hood. Or if you're crushing hazardous drugs, then by all means, you should have a biological safety cabinet in a negative pressure room. And if you decide to not use any of these devices, you will want to document this evaluation for surveyor review. You're not required to use these devices, but you are required to evaluate it. So surveyors will want to see that. You'll also want to save all of your equipment certification reports for surveyor review. Powder hoods and biological safety cabinets can typically be certified by the same person who does your sterile hoods. And you'll want to refer to manufacturer information for calibration and schedule of other equipment that you use. For competencies, it's really about finding a balance between having enough trained staff on each shift, but not overwhelming yourself with a ridiculous number of competencies. At Children's, we use sort of a train the trainer methodology so that there are multiple trainers who can administer these competencies and make scheduling a lot easier. We also use electronic learning modules when possible and videos to show people correct technique. And then lastly, we use technology to track completion dates. We actually have a compliance software that keeps track of these completion dates for us and the subsequent next due date, but this could be as simple as an Excel sheet. For cleaning, we use a combination of electronic tracking with physical reminders. So we have this whiteboard that has a list of all of the activities that you need to do to thoroughly clean the space, and then how to document those cleaning activities. And then at the bottom, there's a space where you can write the date and time of the last clean. And this is really helpful for the next time that a pharmacist or technician goes to that space. They can see when the area was last cleaned and if they need to perform that clean before they perform their compounding. And this probably seems like a no-brainer, but storing your cleaning supplies next to your equipment to be cleaned makes it easy for staff to do the right thing. For MFRs and BUDs, I recommend developing a template for your MFRs to make sure that all of the required information is included every time. Also, being able to store them electronically is very helpful so that you're not keeping track of a bunch of different papers. At Children's, we realized a gap that we had is that we were missing references for some of our MFRs. And if that's the case for your institution, I recommend dividing and conquering the literature review. We divided the formulary alphabetically amongst students, residents, and other pharmacists. And then the designated person, myself, performed a final review just to make sure that everything was in compliance. For some resources for extended BUDs, like I mentioned before, you can use a USP monograph. But some ingredient manufacturers have actually performed their own studies that include both stability data and antimicrobial preservative effectiveness. So Mediska is an example of one of these companies. And just again, you must have both the stability data and the antimicrobial effectiveness data in order to extend a beyond use state. Here's an example of an MFR template. As you can see, it makes it really easy to ensure that you include all the required components, and it makes it easy for your staff to go to an MFR and find the information that they need if it's always in the same order. For compounding records, I recommend using technology to your advantage. We use barcode scanning for our compounding records, which helps make sure that we don't mix up our products. And electronic records also simplify record keeping. And then lastly, this ensures that the compounding record itself and the labeling of the product includes all of the required components. For hazardous drug non-sterile compounding, it's really important to have clear labeling of your medications, equipment, and supplies to keep them separate from your non-hazardous medications, equipment, and supplies. So we have a designated area at Children's for hazardous non-sterile compounding, and then we also have a designated non-sterile hood in our hazardous compounding space. And you'll see in the middle here, we have these little cards that say oral hazardous liquids are ready to be checked. So how we do it is when after our technician draws up the oral hazardous liquids, instead of bringing them over to the pharmacist, which is another opportunity for something to be spilled, we leave them in the hazardous area, give that card to the pharmacist, and then they are able to come over to check the hazardous oral liquids. You just want to reduce as much transfer as possible. Here's a template of a risk assessment, and I apologize for it being small, but hopefully in your PDF version, you can make it larger if you want to see the different components. But basically, you need to evaluate the type of drug, so the NIOSH category, who is going to be manipulating it, what type of manipulations they are going to be performing, and subsequently, what routes of exposure are possible. And then in the second half, what I do is perform a literature review to determine what the risk of exposure is. So how well documented is the toxicity that could potentially occur and what dose of exposure is needed to then determine how likely it is or potentially unlikely for a staff member to be exposed to that dose of the drug while just performing compounding duties. And then this is used to determine the PPE and engineering controls that technicians and pharmacists use for each different activity that they could be performing with the medication. And sometimes we find that there is a huge risk of a very toxic effect at a low dose, and we actually increase our requirements beyond what's required in USP 800. So you really need to make sure that you have a gut check of, are we doing the safest thing for our staff? Because although a risk assessment is a great tool to make USP 800 less burdensome, you need to make sure you're doing the right thing. So here is my last learning assessment question. Which of the following resources or strategies can be used to extend the beyond use state of a compounded non-sterile product? A, stability study, B, a USP monograph, C, refrigeration, or D, clinical experience? Yes, B is the correct answer. So a USP monograph can be used to extend beyond use states. A stability study alone cannot be used. You must also have the antimicrobial effectiveness data. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Michelle, who will talk about community implementation of these standards.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Holly. So I'll take a couple of minutes here and go through some community implementation considerations. So a few things to think about. I think as community pharmacists, we need to think about, what do we need to do? Who, what, where, and why are we doing what we're doing? And what are our resources? So where can we turn? Colleagues, potential vendors, subscriptions that we may have access to can offer us some free gap analysis for what we do in our practice and where the guidelines are versus where we're currently practicing. And then thinking about key areas of compliance. So it's not just magic mouthwash. And what is magic mouthwash anyway? Do we have a formula? Do we have a standard that the practitioners in our communities are using? With our environment and our equipment, are we ensuring a consistent process? Are our personnel trained? And then do we have quality components and maintenance of those components throughout the receiving, the reviewing, and the storage stages of what we're doing? So this is just a picture of my pharmacy in Basketball. We have an open concept in the pharmacy, but I'm fortunate enough that one of my buildings, because they were built in the early 1900s, we've got second floors, and in the late 90s, when I started at Bowman Drugstore Basketball Pharmacy, we actually did infusion compounding upstairs, and I've converted that area into our primary compounding area. So I'm blessed with a fair amount of space. This is a picture of what our actual compounding and flavoring area looks like in the pharmacy, just to think about like what we're doing as far as that goes. But then thinking about in the pharmacy, who are designated people? And Jared and I are primarily compounding personnel in the pharmacy, along with one technician that's been trained. We're handling and supervising the cleaning and the receiving and storing of our compounding components. Thinking about how you're documenting your processes. Do you have formulas? Can your team find them? Thanks to our pharmacy management system or PMS, we're able to store templates and then document the ingredients and use within our PMS. We've also got our recipes or formulas stored out on a Google Drive for easy sharing and review. And then we use Google Drive forms for documentation of our cleaning. So a fairly inexpensive process to ensure that the staff knows what's been done, what needs to be done as the day begins and ends. And then within a community pharmacy, thinking a little bit about what your PMS can offer you. Are you able to easily build, copy, and modify those master formulas? Do you know who's modifying them? How do you document that? Can you link documents to your compounding records, substantiating the beyond use dates you're using, utilizing ingredient barcode verification with weighing, tracking lot and expiration dates, as well as formulas and batches? Can you provide the patient a compounded summary sheet? Do you have good tech support with your pharmacy management system? And then thinking about whether or not that scale is integrated. So as Holly alluded to before, just a few implementation considerations with these new 795 rules. I was speaking with a former member of the PEB last night, and she said to look for implementation of this by 2026. So last quarter of 2025, we anticipate this to go into effect. One maybe more common piece that happens in community pharmacy is the flavoring of items. So on this slide, I have a little bit alluding to that rule that was mentioned at a meeting earlier this year around ensuring that there is an exception to 795 as it relates to flavoring, and verifying that it's no more than 5% of the product, and then it can be um, considered in this way. The pharmacist shall label the flavoring prescription with a beyond use date that shall be no longer than 14 days of stored in a refrigerator, and document that addition of flavoring within the record. And thinking about, how to provide a prescription before a pharmacist may add flavoring to an over-the-counter product. And that rule is incorporated by reference into USP 800 and 825. So again, I think for as community practitioners, this is a lot of process to implement. Why are we doing this? How can we do this most efficiently? And at the end of the day, we're doing it for all those patients that need us to be able to take care of them through the magic mouthwash, the puppy that needs a blood pressure lowering event, or the kiddos that we're trying to take care of in our pharmacy. So look to those as we're implementing these changes. So as a learning assessment, I've got one for you all. In the new Wisconsin FAR 15 exception, which actions must be taken in the course of adding a flavoring agent? A, the pharmacist shall ensure that the flavoring agent is no more than 5% of the product's total volume. The pharmacist shall label the flavoring prescription with a BUD that shall be no longer than 14 days if stored in a refrigerator, or the pharmacist shall document the addition of flavoring as part of the prescription record. The document shall include type of flavoring agent, manufacturer, lot number, and expiration date, or all of the above. We're 1 minute over. What's the answer to this one? Thanks, everybody. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions. If you've got a question, if you would please approach the mic with those. And I thank you for your attendance and being here with us this afternoon.